Chronicles of the Grim Reaper, The Last Guardian, by Griz Calderon. The sky was unusually clear that day. From the mountain top, Dexter and his mate could see for miles, the forests below alive with the colors of life. They had flown down to one of their favorite spots, a waterfall hidden deep in the woods, where the water tumbled over smooth rocks into a pristine pool. The sun reflected off the surface, creating glimmers of light that flickered across their scales. It was a peaceful day, like so many before it. Dexter drank deeply from the cool water, his massive form casting an extended shadow over the rocks. His mate, always a few steps ahead, stood beside him, gazing into the distance. But the sky began to shift. The vibrant blue slowly turned an ominous gray, and the wind began to stir. Storms were nothing new, but there was something different about this one. Dexter raised his head, water dripping from his jaws, and looked toward the horizon. Thick clouds were rolling in, moving with a purpose, and with them came a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time: unease. He glanced over at his mate, his amber eyes narrowing with concern. She, too, had noticed the change, her scales shimmering in the dimming light. They had been through storms before, but Dexter had lived long enough to know that danger often followed when the winds shifted like this. "We should head back," he rumbled, his voice deep and cautious. Dexter and his mate returned to the mountain as the sky began to shift. Dark clouds rolled in from the horizon, covering the land below. The approaching storm was unsettling, and the air hummed with tension. High from their perch, and too restless to settle in for the evening, they watched the storm creep across the sky. As they sat side by side on the mountain's edge, Dexter's instincts told him to stay alert, but his mate, ever the gentler of the two, was focused elsewhere. She had always been more compassionate, her heart softer. "Look," she said, pointing toward the village nestled in the valley below. Through the thickening trees, they could just make out the faint flicker of flames. "Something's wrong. The humans are in trouble." From their vantage point, they could see the flicker of firelight, smoke beginning to rise from the village. His instincts told him to stay away, to remain in the safety of their mountain home. But he knew his mate too well. She wouldn't let it go. She had a kind soul, always wanting to help those in need, even if they were humans. He had seen what humans could do, the destruction they were capable of, but she hadn't experienced it the way he had. She didn't know the pain of losing loved ones to their cruelty. "We should let them be," he urged, his wings already unfurling, ready to take flight. "Humans do not understand us. They will see us as a threat." But she was already stepping forward, her fiery wings stretching wide. "We can help. We cannot just watch them suffer." Reluctantly, Dexter agreed. He would follow her anywhere, even if it meant risking everything. She was his heart, and he could never refuse her. With a powerful beat of their wings, they took to the sky, soaring just above the treetops as they headed toward the village. Dexter's memories of that day were still vivid, burned into his mind like the flames that had consumed the village. He could still see her, his mate, flying ahead of him as they descended toward the village, her brilliant wings cutting through the smoke. She was always the first to act, always the one leading the charge. He admired her bravery, but on that day he had begged her to stay back, to let the humans handle their own problems. But she hadn't listened. She had wanted to help, to save the humans from the fire, even when he knew they would never see it that way. The storm had darkened the sky, and the fire had spread quickly through the village, the flames dancing wildly in the wind. As they neared, Dexter's instincts screamed at him to stop, to turn back. But his mate was already too far ahead, too determined to help. He had tried to stay close, but the humans had seen them coming long before they arrived. Fear overtook them, and before they could convey their intentions, the humans had launched their attack. They had stopped briefly at a stream, filling their mouths with water in a desperate attempt to help extinguish the flames. But just as they soared toward the fire, chains and nets flew through the air, catching his mate in mid-flight. The water spilled from her mouth as she struggled against the bindings, the life-saving effort wasted. Dexter roared in fury, diving toward her to free her, but the humans were too many. They surrounded her, pulling her down with all their strength, striking at her with spears and arrows. Dexter fought with everything he had, his massive wings beating against the wind as he tried to reach her. But it was too late. He watched, helpless, as the humans overwhelmed her, their fear turning into violence. She had fallen, her body crashing to the ground, her golden scales dimming as the life drained from her. Dexter circled the sky above her, roaring in agony, unable to save her. His heart had shattered that day, and no matter how many times he replayed the events in his mind, he could never change the outcome. Years had passed since that day, but the pain had never left Dexter. He had retreated to the mountain, alone, the last of his kind. The world below continued without him, but he had no interest in it. He spent his days wandering the forests, flying aimlessly over the mountains, and drinking from the waterfall where he and his mate had once spent their days. It was there, one quiet morning, that he met someone that changed his life. Dexter had been drinking from the stream, his massive form reflected in the water, when he felt something unusual. A touch. A tiny hand rested gently on his face. Startled, he lifted his head, ready to defend himself, but what he saw was not an enemy. Before him stood a fearless little girl with long red hair and bright blue eyes, her gaze filled with curiosity. "You're real," she had whispered, her hand still resting on his scales. "You're my dragon." Dexter stood frozen, unable to understand how a human could touch him so gently, so fearlessly. He had seen humans before, but none had ever treated him like this. The little girl spent hours with him that day, talking to him, telling him stories about her life, and made up stories about beautiful dragons living happily high in the mountains. He couldn't respond, but he listened. For the first time since losing his mate, he felt something other than pain, a strange comfort in her presence. Over the years, the girl returned day after day, year after year, as she grew from a child into a young woman. She never missed a day, always coming to the waterfall to spend time with him. She told him about the world beyond the mountain, about her dreams, and about the stories she had heard. Dexter listened, finding peace in her words, her voice a comfort to his broken heart. What she never told him was that, in her dreams, she had been visited by a special dragon. The young woman often dreamt of a beautiful dragon who revealed glimpses of the life she once lived, of the love she had shared with another dragon, and of the peaceful days they had spent on the mountain. Through these dreams, she learned about Dexter's grief, his loneliness, and his longing for the one he had lost. And in those dreams, the dragon told her that one day Dexter would need her, and she would be the one to help him find peace. Years passed, and Dexter had grown old. His once powerful wings were no longer strong enough to carry him far, and his scales, once vibrant, had dulled with age. He spent his final years in solitude, but the young woman he had met at the waterfall when she was just a child never left his side. Every day, she came to sit with him by the water, her presence a comforting balm in his old age. But Dexter knew his time was coming. One morning, he could barely lift himself from the ground, his body weak and tired. He made his way to the waterfall one last time, the effort almost too much for him. As he lay beside the water, his body too heavy to move, the young woman appeared, just as she always had. She knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his face. "Dexter," she whispered, "I know you're tired. It's okay. You don't have to fight anymore." Her voice was soft, and in her eyes he saw the same compassion that he had once seen in his mate. "You are a legend," she continued, her voice trembling, "and I know how much you loved her. I know in my heart that she is waiting for you." Dexter closed his eyes, the weight of the world slipping away. In his final moments, he heard a voice he had not heard before, the Grim Reaper. "Dexter," the Reaper's voice was calm and steady, "you have been patient, and you have carried your sorrow for long enough. It is time to rest." Dexter felt a strange sense of peace as the Reaper spoke. He had carried the burden of loss for so many years, but now, in the presence of the Reaper, he felt it lifting. The Reaper extended his hand, and beside him stood a familiar figure, his beloved Fiona, her golden scales shimmering vibrantly. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with the same love they had shared in life. "I've been waiting for you," she said softly. Dexter let out a final breath, his massive body falling still as his soul joined Fiona's. But as his physical form lay motionless by the waterfall, his spirit began to change. The weariness of his long years, the dullness of his once mighty wings, and the deep lines of age that marked his face all started to fade. In life, Dexter had been a fearsome sight, tall and majestic, with scales of deep, dark sapphire that gleamed under the sun. His wings, massive and powerful, stretched wide and strong, their edges lined with silver that shimmered like molten metal in the light. His tail, long and muscular, could take down trees in one sweep, and his claws were sharp, capable of tearing through stone. His eyes, once a fiery amber, burned with wisdom and strength, a reflection of the countless years he had lived and the battles he had fought. Yet in those final years, the vibrancy of his youth had been lost to time. His scales had dulled, their shimmer muted under the weight of sorrow and loss. His wings, once capable of carrying him across boundless distances, now struggled to lift him from the ground. His once fearsome claws had grown brittle, and the spark of fire that had always lived in his chest had dimmed to a mere ember. But now, as Dexter's spirit rose beyond his earthly form, he returned to his prime. His scales brightened once more, glowing with the deep, rich blue of the open ocean, catching the light as if they were made of the stars themselves. His wings, wide and strong again, unfurled with new life, their silver edges shining with the brilliance of 1,000 suns. His tail, once heavy and sluggish, regained its strength and elegance, moving with the grace of a serpent in flight. His claws, sharp and gleaming, were as powerful as they had been in his youth. And his eyes, those amber eyes, once again burned with the fire of life, full of energy, wisdom, and love. Dexter stood beside Fiona, no longer the tired, broken dragon he had become in the last years of his life, but the fierce and magnificent creature he had always been. The two dragons, side by side, looked at each other with a renewed strength. They had found each other again, their love and bond unbroken by time. Together, they took flight once more, soaring into the sky where they belonged, free from the pain of the world. Their wings cut through the air with ease as they soared high above the mountains and forests, free and together at last. As the Reaper watched them disappear into the horizon, he lingered for a moment, his hooded figure silhouetted against the fading light. The passing of Dexter marked the end of an era. The last dragon on Earth had taken his final flight, and with his departure, a whole species vanished from the world of the living. The Reaper, who had guided countless souls across time, paused to reflect on the gravity of this moment. The dragons, creatures of legend and power, had once roamed freely, their lives connected with the natural world. But now, their time on Earth was over. Yet, they would not be forgotten, not by him, and certainly not by the young woman who had loved and cared for Dexter in his final years. In the distance, the woman sat quietly by the waterfall, unaware of the Reaper's presence, but feeling the impact of loss and a strange sense of peace wash over her. She knew, in her heart, that Dexter was no longer in pain. He had found his peace, reunited with the one he had loved most. The Reaper turned to the woman, his dark figure blending into the shadows of the forest. For a moment, he lingered, watching her as she stared into the water, her eyes reflecting both sorrow and acceptance. She did not see him, but somehow she sensed the completion of a journey. His silent presence brought with it a finality, a quiet understanding of what had been lost, but also of what had been found. The Reaper, who had seen countless creatures pass from life to death, rarely witnessed such profound connections left behind. The dragon's reign on Earth had ended, but their story, one of love, loss, and endurance, would continue. Not just in the ephemeral realm where Dexter and Fiona now resided, but in the heart of the young woman who would carry their legacy. Without a word, the Reaper slipped deeper into the shadows, leaving the woman by the waterfall, surrounded by the fading light of both grief and hope. As he vanished, his thoughts lingered on the balance between life and death, on the delicate thread that connected all beings, human or otherwise. The dragons were gone from this world, but their legacy endured, engraved into time itself, leaving the waterfall, the mountains, and the memories of the dragons to rest in peace. The end.